welcome to the Move Daily Health Podcast, where we share information to empower you to be your own health hero.
Welcome back to the Move Daily Health Podcast. I am Dane Wallace, here again with the lovely Fréyja Spence, and today we are going to talk about how you can actually define health, or what normal health is. Now, before we jump into that, just a quick reminder, you can find us on Instagram at move_daily_EDS and on our website at movewelldaily.com. So what is normal health? This is a very ambiguous subject. Even the CDC has a very lengthy description of what they consider to be well-being, which is where health fits. And within health, there are elements that are subjective and some that are actual metrics. For both, there are huge ranges of tolerance and normalcy. So today we're going to discuss how you can define it for yourself as a means to also understand the information and the claims out there. We're also going to discuss some of the things that we've normalized as a society that hold us back from health. And as I said, some of these aspects are subjective, others are not, but exist within a huge range. So you have heart rate, blood pressure, blood markers, aerobic capacity, markers of strength, markers of functional capacity of activities of daily living, all sorts of things. Right, Fréyja?
Yes. Well, and even with the ones that are both the subjective and the ones that have metrics, say like your heart rate, they're both important, right? How well someone feels they can handle the demands of their life, that's important. You can't put it on a numerical scale, and it will be different. I mean, there are questionnaires around that kind of thing to gauge subjective measures, but even then, really depends on the person, on their age, their environment, their entire life situation. But I would say that even with the metrics, like say blood pressure or heart rate, there is a wide range, and most people, even if they know those numbers, don't necessarily know or aren't necessarily taught what influences them. So if you hear what your cholesterol levels are, okay, great, you know some numbers, but do you know what actions will influence them? Same with blood pressure. Do you know which actions will influence blood pressure readings? So those are the things that matter for us as end users. It's very important, medically for people to have those numbers documented, your blood markers documented, and so on, especially in the context of being unwell. But for you as a human, the actions are really what define that side of your health. And then, of course, subjective measures are equally important, because our sense of well-being is also going to influence what those metrics are.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to understand, like, how do you feel when you're doing the right things? And, what does healthy feel like, right? Some people live in this place where they feel like they're healthy, but they don't really know anything else, because their baseline has been what it's been since they, were kids and they grew up and they just became what they were. I remember when I was an undergrad, as one of our, I took physical and health education in Queens, and one of our first classes, the prof was like, so who here is healthy? And I don't know, I think a smattering of us put up our hands, and he's like, okay, well, what does that mean? What makes you healthy? And I'll admit I don't really understand, or don't remember, where that conversation went or what was said in that class, as for most of my classes back 20 years ago.
Oh, God.
But yeah, health is so subjective. And so today we're going to cover a few of those things and just talk through some of the actions we can take to improve our health.
Yeah, and Dane, do you want to kick us off with the discussion of gravitational pull and BMI? Because these days, most people, as soon as if you ask them, like, what's healthy, one of the first three things that they'll mention is BMI or body weight as a measure, and that has a significant number of flaws with it.
Yeah, so body weight is it's a really nuanced topic, and what we've normalized in society is that smaller is healthier. Like, basically, you can kind of take that, the smaller you are, the healthier you are, period, hard stop, is kind of just what we've normalized. And BMI is the metric that the medical institutes have started using, or not started using, have used for a long time now, to put us into this narrow band of health, which is crazy, because if you look at the history of BMI, and I recently wrote an article on weight loss that you can find on the blog, on the website, and BMI was originally created to measure population statistics. It was never intended to measure individual health, but now we have the most data points for BMI, and so it's now something that we use across the board to measure health of individuals, which is insane. To take myself as an example, I have been like very overweight or obese for the majority of my 20s and into my 30s. I would have declared myself pretty healthy through those times, and I wouldn't say that I was obese, but according to BMI I was, and that was because I carried such a high muscle mass. And that's obviously misleading. Why? Because muscle mass is our largest endocrine organ, and it is a huge marker of our metabolic health. The more muscle you have, the more potential you have to be metabolically healthy, right? And so another thing we've normalized, and it's very bad, is commenting on the weight of others. So we will see somebody, we meet somebody who said, "Oh man, you've lost so much weight. You must be doing so great." Or on the flip side, you see somebody who's gained weight, like, "Ooh, something bad must be happening to that person." And you don't know. A lot of people will lose a lot of weight during times of high stress. That can mean their health has declined during that time. This is why we always encourage people not to comment on the weight of others, because you don't know the story behind what's gone on with that person. So to correlate smaller with healthier is definitely untrue, and especially in older populations, because if you get over the age of like 70 and you get into a low BMI, you're at a much higher risk of dying.
It's probably a nicer way to put that, but it is
kick in the bucket.
True.
No, that's not what you're saying. Okay, yeah. Dirt nap. And in general, we live in a very obesogenic environment right now, which means that it's very easy to gain weight. And BMI can be misleading because it does, again, it's just a population statistic. It puts you in a narrow band. It just puts us into categories. And as the article I was mentioning before, just understanding, having a doctor tell you that you are overweight or obese can trigger these negative chronic stress reactions that even if you're otherwise healthy based on blood pressure, cardiovascular health, all these other things, but if you've been told you are overweight or obese, that can actually increase your risk threefold of developing metabolic syndrome, which is just, other factors of basically chronic disease.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it also, the main issue too is that, you can have two people of the exact same weight, no matter where they are on the scale. It doesn't matter. Two people of the exact same weight, and one will have a completely different health status than the other one. So really, weight is not the be-all, end-all. We do live in an environment where we have a lot more caloric availability and less nutrient availability, which is certainly a challenge. But you can have two people of the exact same total body weight, and if you have one person who has health supporting actions like their sleep, their stress management, they live in a good environment, supportive environment, they move regularly, they'll have a very different outcome than someone who is the exact same weight. Honestly, we could be talking about a 100-pound person or a 200-pound person, whatever, and they'll have a very different outcome from that person if that person's sedentary, eats largely heavily processed foods. And by processed foods, we don't mean those Terra chips that you got with coconut oil or something like that that's made outside of your home. We just mean when you don't recognize most of the ingredients on it, or it's from a fast food outlet on a regular basis, there are a lot of oils in there that your body just does not process well. Much, much higher sugar than if you were to make the exact same food yourself at home, that kind of thing. And we recognize that there are a lot of limitations there that would bring us down a different conversation entirely in terms of food deserts and distribution. But if we just look at the health supportive habits, they can exist outside of weight. And that's where there was a recent study published from U of T where they put people on a lower sugar diet and they improved their health markers. Their weight didn't change very much, but all their health markers improved. So blood markers and fasting insulin levels, those are very important when it comes to a chronic disease state. And so that's where when we only focus on BMI and the scale, we lose focus of the things that are actually really important, like lean mass. And are you supporting your lean mass with the things that you do every day as far as activity and sleep and recovery and food and whatnot? And just to share my own story about weight, when I was really unwell, I lost a rapid amount of weight in a very short amount of time. And so I was being weighed every single day to ensure I wasn't still declining. And the goal was to obviously gain back the weight I had just lost. I didn't at all. Like, I never looked at the scale. I got on the scale every single day with my back to it because I didn't need to know. What I needed to know was that I was doing the health supportive actions every single day to get better. That was it. So the arbitrary number that the doctors had set for me was not one that I wanted to be hyper-focused on. I'd never been concerned about, not concerned. I'd never had a scale in the house. Like, growing up, we didn't. So I don't know if any of us really knew our weights other than our physical check-ins. But I couldn't do anything to like really influence that number. So it wasn't one I wanted to track. I wanted to track the other things like, you know, my activity level had to be low. I was doing things like meditation at 16 years old and learning how to reduce my stress levels. And those were the health supportive actions I could take in the situation I was in. And they existed completely outside of the weight. The weight did what it needed to do when my actions were in place. And that's where, you know, even just telling somebody like, you've got to lose 20 pounds. Well, they might also do that in a very health deprecating way. So they might yo-yo a diet or starve themselves and do so in a very stressed out state, feeling horribly about themselves as if they're failing as a human when it's not the case. And if we instead encourage people to move as they're able and to eat to the best of their abilities within the resources they have, that alone changes the narrative. And it goes back to that study about it was done in a hotel, and just telling the hotel staff, the women that were cleaning the rooms, it was with women exclusively, I believe, just telling them that their jobs were actually very supportive towards their health, they wound up moving more and their health markers went up because they realized that, yeah, all that, we would call that NEAT activity, like non-exercise activity thermogenesis, just means like you're doing a lot of movement cumulatively throughout your day. It allowed them to see that, like, oh, hey, my job's actually really health supportive. I don't have time to go to the gym, but like I'm bending down, I'm picking things up. They move through a ton of different ranges. Anybody who cleans a dozen rooms, I don't know how many rooms per day, but like that's a lot of physical work. And as soon as they were told, like, your job's actually helping you be healthy, it changed their whole viewpoint about like, oh, I can do this. This is cool. Yeah.
Yeah, psychologically, if what you're doing, if you feel like what you're doing is good for you,
it changes
you will be healthier. If you feel like you're doing things that are awful, I mean, again, that's going to trigger this negative cascade that will be detrimental to health. And just to further on, you know, your story of body weight, if I go to mine, just to let people understand, when I was 20 years old, I weighed 135 pounds. And that put me in the normal BMI. Currently, 38, I am 165. I'm overweight for my BMI. Like, I am in the overweight category for BMI at my weight right now. And that is crazy as far as I'm concerned. When I was at my heaviest, I was obese. And again, wildly inaccurate in terms of what should, you know, when we think of obesity, we think, oh, like you're really unhealthy. You know, these are the things we've normalized in society, and it's just not true when you use these metrics that are, as much as it's a concrete metric, it's extremely subjective because, again, BMI is not based on anything.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people do think, to your point about weight loss, they think that saying, oh, you look so healthy is like a compliment, but it can actually be fairly condescending whether somebody has gained weight or lost weight. Like, at the end of the day, I'm sure we can all figure out a whole lot of other greetings than like commenting on someone's body appearance as a form of saying hello. But it's oddly standardized in our society in a weird way. It's not something that I partake in.
Yeah, and so instead, focusing on your total weight or your BMI, think about your lean mass. If you want to be healthier, again, forget those numbers, forget the gravitational pull, forget that. If you are under-muscled and, like I say, over-fat, that is a recipe for long-term unhealth. It just is, because your largest metabolic organ, muscle, is so small. That's going to lead to problems down the road. So focusing on building lean muscle mass, especially as we age, because again, the more lean mass we have, the better we can do at shrinking that gap between health span and lifespan at the end of our lives. So think about your insides.
Yes, that's what I like to say.
Not just your poundage, because there's so much more to that. And this takes us nicely into cardiovascular health, Fréyja.
Yeah. And just on the note of insides, your cardiovascular system is part of your insides. I think it's really helpful to people to realize that everything in your body signals. When people think of hormones, they think of like their ovaries or their testes, and it kind of stops at that. And that's not, I don't know why, but I guess we're not really taught otherwise. I'm trying to think of like grade school, high school. I don't think they really talked about it beyond that. Then again, there are certain things that we didn't really even know until the last 10 years. So maybe they're teaching kids now. Not sure. Suffice it to say, adipose tissue, which is to say your fatty tissue, you have visceral stores, which are near your organs. You have subcutaneous stores, which are like the fat under your skin. They serve to signal. So it signals to other tissues throughout the body. Likewise, your muscle also signals. That's why we've cited this on other podcasts, both with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and then one of the ones that we did in the second season, but it's an endocrine organ. So signaling here in this case is that like if you have healthy muscle mass, meaning lean mass, meaning you move on a regular basis, however you enjoy moving, you will have healthier muscle mass, and it serves to signal to other tissues. And so that's where you get positive signaling feedback to your liver, positive signaling to your heart. You exercise your heart. It's its own type of muscle. There actually also, there is evidence now that your heart muscle secretes things like EPO now. We don't know. We are always learning, but the point is you should know that all of your insides are always signaling to everything else in your system. And it can be for better or worse, because they can be health promoting cycles of like we get an inflammatory response to exercise, but we also get anti-inflammatory aspects there. But if we tend to be more sedentary and eat heavily processed foods and don't sleep, and say we also smoke, like if you have all of those things that are health risks, you are living in a more chronically inflamed state. So regardless of your total weight, there will be issues systemically with the insides, Yeah,
and that is precisely why we are named Move Daily, because movement has such a massive impact on cellular communication within the body. It's not just about calories and burning calories and energy. It is movement changes the way that our insides communicate, and it creates who we are. So.
And with that said, when you look, if you were to say Google, what's a normal heart rate? A normal resting heart rate is a pretty substantial range. Like you'll find numbers from 60 to 90, 60 to 100. Like if my heart's going 100 beats per minute, I feel like I'm working out. Like for me personally, heart rate tends to be, in the low 40s at night. That's comfortable for me. And by that, I mean like if it's higher because something's happened, whether I'm unwell or injured, and it's higher than that in the 50s, close to the 60s, it's disruptive to my sleep. It feels off. So everyone has a different normal and normal range. We have a range, and within that wide range, we can have our own personal normal. It's about trends over time. And the same is true with blood pressure. We do know that at a certain point, pressure point, we have a higher risk of we have higher risks of strokes, heart attacks, and pulmonary failure at the extreme, but right pump failure. Anyway, we do know that like those are finely tuned pressure systems, and we do have outer limits at which they will be well. But again, the range can be fairly broad, and it's more important that you know what actions you take every day impact those numbers. So, I had a friend when we were in our 20s, she did a lot of dieting with like Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and things like that. And at the time, I don't know if they've changed, but those programs are focused 100% on calorie counting. So she ate like white bread and bologna slices and pop, but it stayed within her calories.
Points.
So she was then told that she had hypertension, like low-grade high blood pressure, and needed to go on medication. Well, she wasn't active. She was eating heavily processed foods. She was a fairly anxious and stressed person, but without any solid management tools of that. And, you know, when somebody in their 20s who's not tapped into any of the actions they can take to take care of blood pressure, I understand that there's, we're not making commentary on whether somebody should be on blood pressure medication or not. But the actions that she could also take herself, whether she had to also take meds or not to stay safe, the actions that she could take were not taught and were not taken. So that means like going for walks every day. As long as you're able to walk, go for walks. If not, we can find other ways of moving. You can make sure that your sleep is in check. You can make sure that your stress is in check, because that's a huge one when it comes to blood pressure. I'm pretty sure it's in every single cartoon as kids, right? Somebody's head like starts to expand, get red, and blow off. And that was like anyone who drew cartoons was just expressing the sensation of someone's blood pressure going up with rage. Yeah. So there are action items that we can take to take care of blood pressure, our food quality, how physically active we are, whether it's in your job or whether it's, taking movement breaks to get you up from your desk, whether it is gym time or not. But we need to know that when someone says you have high blood pressure, the question should be, okay, what is it that I can do throughout my day that will improve it? Dain has shared his story before where he used to go to the gym 4 or 5 days a week, but had high blood pressure. That's because he wasn't doing any cardiovascular activity at all. And we do see that a fair bit. With gym goers, we encourage all of our clients to go for walks. It's like one of the most, as long as they're able to, that's one of the most beneficial things you can do.
Yeah, and my blood pressure was always high, even when we measured it when I was a teenager, mm-hmm. and before I started going to the gym. When I was 135 pounds in my normal BMI, my blood pressure was as bad as it ever was. Mm-hmm. It's a result of many things. It's not just genetic. There's reasons why your blood pressure is indicating that it is high, and it's just to be curious about that. For me, I just wrote it off because my dad and my grandma always had high blood pressure, so should I, right? False. Try and look at these other metrics that we're talking about to see if you can drill down and figure out what is the cause.
Yeah, and there are certainly times when we have some clients who've needed medication for things like blood pressure, whether to like boost it up or to bring it down a little. And there's no fault in that. No. We need to also do the health supportive things that like optimize your heart as a pump and optimize your lungs as well. And that comes down to simply like cardiovascular activity, any form of ambulation, any form of it. And it doesn't have to be high intensity, but it can also be high intensity. So you could do your long 60-minute cardiovascular activity, whether it's swimming, recumbent bike, cycling, walking, running, whatever it is, or you can do high intensity intervals on any of those implements, or even up and down the stairs in your house if you have stairs. I realize a lot of people live in condos that don't.
Yeah.
So, but there are definitely like a lot of ways we can address that. It's just we have to recognize that like high blood pressure is not totally out of our realm of something we can influence. The challenge is adherence. Once there is a problem, the challenge is adherence to an active action and protocol.
Yeah, and I like to have people think of the heart as the backup generator. The main generator is movement. In moving your body around, your muscles are going to pump blood all around the body just by moving. If you think about it in that way, muscles can spare the heart of working too hard throughout a lot of activities. Exercise is going to build a stronger heart, and it's also going to spare the amount of work that a heart has to do. So if you think of it in that regards of thinking, okay, the heart, obviously it's going to do work when it has to. We need it. It is extremely important to living. But if you can use your body and move around more, you're going to spare that heart, and you're going to have lower blood pressure overall. Again, the magic of movement.
That's funny. I wasn't sure where you're going with that. I was like, what's the primary one? Are you suggesting the brain? I was like, oh, got it. Right.
So you see here, the brain is the number one heart we have.
It's like, I don't know where you... It's fine. No, that worked out. I just wasn't sure at first.
She was so afraid I was going to say something dumb, guys.
That's not true at all. That is not true.
Everyone who knows me is like...
No, not at all. But yeah, another like your respiratory rate. Ooh, sorry.
Smoke in the mic.
Sounds. your breathing rate is also something that will influence cardiovascular activity, so your heart rate and your blood pressure, and it can be considered one of the vital signs of the body. And what we've found in the past, and we've had some young athletes in this boat, we've had some people who are 3 times their age in this boat, but anxiety and stress can drive up our breathing rate, and it happens very subtly. It's not like this big obvious thing. And when I've assessed some people who are experiencing a lot of anxiety and pain, and we see their breathing rate is at like literally 20 breaths per minute, that's going to drive your blood pressure up and then potentially drop down, because if you don't get enough oxygen, that can perpetuate fainting spells. But it's going to further drive up a stressed state. So your body doesn't really know whether you're breathing really heavily because you're being like shallow but heavy in the sense of high frequency. 20 per minute is crazy high, and your body doesn't know whether that's because like you're I don't know, running from something really scary like a fire or a flood, which is terrible because those things are happening right now, or you just had a really bad work email come through. So it is really important that we know what things we can check in on. So if you are active and you do partake in cardiovascular activity and you see that your heart rate is, or you feel that your heart rate is trending up, that would be where we have to also check in on like how well are you recovering in terms of sleeping? Is it high quality? How high is your stress? Screen times, I find, jack up heart rate if we're on screens late. So like we have a lot of like, this is where if every single night all of us went back to like 1880, just at 5 p.m. everybody went back to 1880.
If only.
That would be it would be an interesting experiment. Not that we can do that, but we do have a lot of influences that will, outside external influences that will jack up our heart rate. I mean, including people that you don't necessarily communicate well with. You know, that can be, having a high tense conversation late at night can jack things up, have an impact on your sleep, and then you rinse and repeat the next day. So there are a lot of things, and I know that we're being slightly ambiguous with this, but the long and the short of it is that those are vital signs that you can directly impact with all of your daily actions. And when it comes to chronic disease risk, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, like they take a very long time to develop, a really long time. And everyone has a different timeline just because everybody's bodies have different tolerance points. And you could have, I knew a doctor who ate McDonald's every single day and somehow he's fine. And I would be like in a bad way. So everybody's body has a different tolerance point. But if we can check off that, like, yes, I move often, and yes, I try to eat as well as possible at home or with whole ingredients, that kind of thing, to the best of my abilities, and yes, I manage my stress, like those are things that will help you with cardiovascular disease risk. And in a very concrete way, because it takes a very, very long time, to the point where one thing I learned recently is that they found evidence in terms of atherosclerosis, sorry, I can't speak today, in young, like 20 to 23-year-olds who'd unfortunately died for other reasons, but they looked into their hearts and their arteries and found that there's evidence of that sort of plaque buildup. It's subtle, but it just goes to show that it can actually start at a really young point, and people can have a high tolerance to the point where like an artery is 90% or 95% closed before they start feeling angina, like symptoms of that chest heaviness.
For the record, atherosclerosis is a very hard word to say, so I don't think it's just you.
Okay.
I think I stumble on that like literally. Atherosclerosis.
And last but not least, a lot of people will get their information about cardiovascular related things from TV and from movies. And heart attacks in particular are these crazy dramatic events, and they don't actually occur that way for the most part. So that miscommunication can actually cause issues because people don't identify them in their bodies. But also there's miscommunication about, the most recent show where one of the characters got on a Peloton, did a high intensity workout, and then
Sex and the City.
That one that we haven't watched. Sorry to all the people who like it. I don't know. Don't. No, I've never seen it, so I couldn't tell you one way or the other. I just have never seen it. But I do know about this particular thing, because it created a lot of outrage, and the challenge there is that people then interpret it, and we've had clients who are told by friends and family members, oh, you've got to be careful with that exercise stuff, and at the end of the day, that character certainly didn't die because he exercised. That probably helped him combat the fact that he was like a heavy drinker and ate out all the time. And I mean, I don't know about his sleep and stress, but it's safe to say you didn't have like the best inputs.
Correct.
So it is tricky because a lot of people don't necessarily understand that, you know, there are a lot of things that are within your control, and also please don't listen to TV and movies. If you're not sure about something, ask your doctor. And I know that, you know, little kids these days are taught how to identify heart attacks and strokes, which I think is very good because, you know, that way you've got little kids aware of what to look for in perhaps their great-grandparents or grandparents or parents. But I think adults often need those lessons too, to remind them of what it actually looks like, instead of, you know, relying on the dramatic thing in the TV, instead of, hey, maybe somebody had some back discomfort and was really like nauseous and didn't feel great for several hours. Well, in a female body, that can actually be signs of a heart attack, and the need to report to emerge is quite crucial. But if we only ever think that it's like this big fanfare of drama as we see on TV, then that can be problematic.
Yeah, the character Big was an entrepreneur financier, according to the Google machine in front of me. So he probably had a pretty high stress in that job. You know, that was probably a major factor in his heart attack. We're digging in deep to the facts now, folks.
I don't know.
Heads
up.
up.
Fictional character. But yeah, and then that brings us, in terms of action items that will influence all our insides, that brings us to the nutrition side of things, which is a sadly complex issue in today's modern era.
Yeah, and so nutrition, again, this is where what have we normalized really plays a huge part into what people think is healthy versus unhealthy. And I think the biggest thing is convenience when it comes to nutrition, because if we go way back in time, the 1950s roughly, way back in time, but that's really when the narrative around food started to change, because more women were getting out into the workforce, and they started being sold this marketing that, you don't need to be cooking in the kitchen, and like, we can make foods for you, just have to pop it in the oven, and then you can be a working woman. Like it played to the emotions of what was happening at the time in terms of society. And so we had processed foods were really becoming advanced in the Second World War. And so we had a surplus of foods into the 1950s, and we're like, okay, how do we, use these crops or whatever we need to create foods that are more convenience-based? And that's where all this was born. And we had the fast food, processed food industry really took off. TV dinners, that's when they really hit the market. And so now this is day and age. It's like, where can we save time? And convenience foods are just so normalized. And fridges weren't even they didn't become a household item until the 20s or 30s, I don't think. So it's been roughly 100 years that we've had fridges. And before that, we go back to the Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000, 300,000 years. Modern humans, if you want to go 50,000, 60,000 years, 100 years is not a long time for adaptation to occur. And there's been so many changes to our food supply and how we quote unquote create food now. Most food is created in factories. And this is the obesogenic environment that I spoke to earlier. We're basically now just sold like its marketing tells us that this product that was created in a factory is a superfood product versus Coca-Cola, which we know is just full of sugar, but that's not good for you. It's like, well, they're both foods that are ultra processed, have been made in factories, are devoid of nutrients, are high in calories, and yet because a package will tell us one is a superfood and great for us, and the other one we just quote unquote know is bad because it's high in sugar, even though the superfood may have just as much sugar, if not more, and also maybe some horribly unnutritious fats in them. This is where we've normalized one thing and put another one in the doghouse, and yet they are just as bad for human health. But these are things that we have now normalized based on what the pretty package or what celebrity has marketed them or what we grew up with. And we're just told by our parents maybe that this was, oh, this is a healthy option. And that's now what we believe. So that is, to me, in terms of what we have normalized as a society, is we've gotten so far away from where we were before the 1950s in terms of eating real food and taking the time to prepare it and sit down to enjoy it as a family or as a community. And now it's, where can we save time? How can I rapidly get this food into me? And now we're into this whole diet war culture where we're arguing over what diets are best for another. It doesn't matter. It's a total marketing ploy, and it just gets people to bounce from one thing to another. You mentioned Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, that kind of thing. Every single person who has come to me from those backgrounds has only regained more weight from when they started trying to lose weight, because that's all those systems do. They make you lose a bunch of weight, and then obviously you rebound at some point because nobody can live like that forever. This problem gets worse. Oh, I'll go back again because it, quote unquote, worked for me the first time. I'm like, did it? Because you gained a bunch of weight. And then you go back. And so the health continues to decline. In the article I mentioned earlier, yo-yo dieting has shown to have negative long-term health impacts on the human body. If you keep doing it, the more you yo-yo diet, the more likely you are to develop chronic disease. It's not a sustainable approach. And so the whole cooking is boring or cooking takes too long is a narrative that we've just accepted. And now convenience foods are really what's putting us behind the eight ball in terms of our food. And then we have, calorie counting that goes right into play with the diet culture, ultra processed health foods, as I mentioned before, and skipping meals, skipping breakfast. It's making it this intermittent fasting. Some people take it way too far. Eating at all hours of the day, because now you can get food 24 hours a day from all these different outlets. And again, if you're getting food at midnight or later, typically that food's probably not super healthy for you. So nutrition really boils down to what have we normalized, and if you really want to take it down to the roots, it's that we've gotten so far away from how much time we feel we should be putting into cooking food because we're so busy and we have all these other priorities. If you want to be healthy, this involves putting conscious effort and time into making your food. And people don't like to hear that because obviously we're sold the narrative that, you can just just eat shakes 3 times a day that are full of all the vitamins and minerals you need and just power through in Silicon Valley. It's like, I don't know if you've seen those guys. They're not the healthiest guys to be marketing yourselves after. So again, from a nutrition perspective, it's trying to just dial back into, think about the human species and how long we existed making our own food and finding our food and foraging and chopping and making it a community event and all these things. And we've gotten so far away from all of that if you want to regain your health or, again, lose a little bit of weight, increase your muscle mass, dial back into how can you become more one with the food process, acquiring your food, cooking your food, taking your time to eat and enjoy your food, rather than just having it fed to you by marketing or convenience.
And we recognize that the accessibility is another,
of course,
massive issue, and definitely one that needs to be addressed on many levels. Because when people don't have access to real food, it's just like that. I feel it's like a human right to clean air, clean water, and real food. There's real food. I've been in pockets of this world where you cannot get a vegetable, and it's atrocious because it's all being exported from that area. It's not in that area. But if you're sitting in a point where you can have access to foods that are grown locally, that reduces also the environmental impact. It also makes it more accessible, the foods that are in other countries, more accessible to the locals of those countries. So there is a huge big picture thing here too, but I do think that bringing it back to the center of understanding how important it is and not seeing it as a waste of time, which is what's been marketed through all layers of the food industry. I think if we bring it back to giving yourself permission to actually sit down and eat and hey, take time to learn how to cook if you don't know how to cook, or take time to make a meal if you do know how to cook, but you have previously thought it's a waste of time. Those are the things, just like taking a walking break or a movement break at home. Those are the breaks that actually give your brain and body space to process, and they can regain creative thinking necessary for your learning or your job or anything else, just mental space. So there's a whole other layer that it impacts, quite apart from like the input to your body. And there's a book called Primate Change, which is really interesting, that talks about how the human body has evolved with the advent of things like more processed foods and fewer foods that need even more chewing. Pandora's Lunchbox is the other one that speaks to that as well. Pandora's
Lunchbox is a great read to expand on what we just spoke about. And again, like there's a larger socioeconomic conversation to have when it comes to food and nutrition, and we really don't have time for that. But a lot of our listeners, we know we have a lot of privilege. There's a lot of our listeners. If we have the privilege to do so, this is where we have to have these conversations, and it starts with those with the means doing what they can, and that is how we change the food environment for everyone.
Availability elsewhere.
Exactly. And when there's food, there's also movement, Fréyja.
Yes. Well, and if you're eating in a way that feels good in your body, like not just gives you a dopamine hit, but that actually digests well and feels good, you are prone to move more. So it becomes like this positive cycle. So if you sleep enough, and you do eat, to the best of your abilities, foods that sit really well with you, you'll also be more motivated to move, which then means that you'll sleep well. And it just cycles through like that. But what's interesting is that when you look into how much movement should be made, when you look at governing bodies, everyone in this country in particular, and probably the US because they have the same or similar guidelines, is fairly familiar with the guideline of doing 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, which really isn't a lot. I know it can feel overwhelming, but if you reframe it in terms of where you can get activity throughout your day versus like 150 minutes that needs to go be spent at a gym, which for some people is easy because that's what they love to do anyway, but for others it can feel like a limitation. So if we reframe it, it can actually make it more accessible. But more importantly, like one thing that's alarming is that the CDC, which obviously is not governing in here, it's the US, says that how much activity you need is dependent on how much weight you want to lose or gain. And I kind of thought, I'm like, well, that's a terrible way to establish a really crappy relationship with movement. And that's an issue that I've seen crop up over the years in a number of different ways, like socially with friends and talking to them, and obviously with work professionally as well, is that we think of movement sometimes or often through what we're taught as a way to maintain or lose weight. And yes, it can contribute to those because it changes how you process food. It obviously changes your metabolic rate because the more lean mass you have, the higher metabolism. But there is a lot more nuance than that. And if we only ever view it as a way of almost like punishment, I need to do this many hours in order to do this to my gravitational pull, then it can be really problematic. Or if we think, oh my gosh, I didn't get this many minutes, I'm going to all of a sudden gain all this weight. Like that's also not accurate. So if we can dissociate it from weight for a minute and actually look at taking care of lean mass, which we spoke to earlier, and then take care of our joints by movement variability, which we've spoken to in other podcasts, and we can link in here on how to get movement variability and why movement matters. We won't go through all of those again. But if we dissociate it from the weight for a minute, a lot of people I think would do a lot better at finding things they enjoy, because it takes off that pressure of like, I didn't push hard enough today, so I didn't sweat hard enough. That means my weight's not going to do what I want. Like, get rid of the weight narrative and enjoy moving and what your body is capable of, no matter what it can do. I've had enough injuries, and that sounds like a weird flex. That's not what I mean. Just meaning that like sometimes I could do one or two things, and that was it. And at least I could do one or two things. So I did those things until I could add the third thing. And sometimes we're talking about like 2 floor-based exercises. Totally fine. It's a great place to just add one more thing. And then there are other times when I was 100% overtraining. And this is something I see in the fitness industry a lot, because we think that we have some like high bar to hold ourselves to. Well, the more experienced you are as a mover, whether you're in health and fitness or not, the more experienced you are, the less effort you have to put in to sustain that. So sustaining strength, like I did aerial last week and I hadn't done it in a year, but because of all the concurrent stuff I do, I was amazed at how much strength for that specific skill was retained. It was pretty surprising, but that just goes to show like it is an accumulation over time. Initially, when we start a thing, we're going to have to do it more frequently because we actually don't have enough capacity to do too much of it. Typically, you can overdo it, but most people are not overtraining in those states when they're learning. But what does tend to happen is if we set a bar of movement and we think that that's what we need to maintain forever, we will run into problems whether we set a really low bar or a really high one, because it's just something that has to fluctuate over time. So even if you're, quote unquote, maintaining your weight, your gravitational pull, again, you should separate your movement as something that like, what is serving my purpose in terms of the things I have to be able to do day to day? What do I have to be able to pick up? What do I have to be able to move around the house and that kind of thing? And then when we're strength training, okay, what things make life easier for me? When we're we're doing cardiovascular activity, what sort of capacity will be easier for me? Am I traveling and doing something that requires a little bit more demand on heart and lungs? Great, then we can train for that. So there are or even with work, do I have to stand for 4 hours at a time? Okay, well, believe it or not, you can actually train to have the tolerance for that and also train movement variability. So I think separating it from weight and being more flexible about our framing of like must be this intensity all the time, and just seeing all the things that feel good and seeing which capacities we can grow, whether strength, mobility, you name it. If we can build all of those over time, then we do far better. But the way that movement's often presented is it can create some barriers. It's like, unless you're doing this extreme thing, then may not bother. You're just not dedicated enough, and that's just not. It's not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, take it back to the nurses, not nurses study, the house cleaners that you mentioned before, right? It's just, how do we reframe this to help people build in more activity to their day-to-day, right? And to understand it's not trying to like create new time. It's how can you take what you're already doing and build that in to get that, again, that cellular input that is going to carry over into your health, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And finally, sleep. Sleep is a big one, and I guess if we talk about how we normalize sleep, I guess it's just normal to be tired all the damn time and be crushing caffeine and just be tired caffeine.
I think a lot of people just don't realize how tired they are.
Correct.
And I've been there where I don't think I realized how run down I was. It was just like, you have a task, it's the execution mode of like, this is what I have to do to accomplish the things that are expected of me, and you do it, and you don't. And then when somebody forces you to stop or you get sick, you realize like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm really, really, really beat.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's what's your baseline? Like, what was it like in your household growing up? Like, how much sleep did your parents get? How much sleep did you get? Then you went away to college, and how much sleep did you get? And then you got a job, and like, do you know what it feels like to be really refreshed and to get steady quality sleep for an extended period of time, and know what that feels like without, caffeine or, other stimulants? A lot of people will think, I'm good because I'm one of the, 2% that actually
can operate on less than 6 hours sleep. Right? If you're getting less than 7 hours sleep, again, if you want to go to CDC recommendations and statistics, less than 7 hours of sleep per night is considered short sleep. If you are getting less than 7 hours a night, you are at a much higher, significantly higher risk for developing diabetes, stroke, heart disease, mental health issues. So if you think you are getting enough sleep, you really just need to ask yourself, okay, do you have any other comorbidities? Like, do you have any health problems? Do you have any mental health, anxiety, depressive problems? Do you have any issues with your relationship, your mood, your energy? Are there other things that are going wrong outside of you just feeling subjectively like, I'm okay, I'm getting enough sleep? And then try and get a little bit more sleep and see, does that help some of those things that might not have been going so well?
Well, the sleep will also impact pain sensation, which is a huge topic in our society. And so there was a study that showed that people who had poor quality sleep, they could predict that post-operatively would need more painkillers because they had greater pain sensitivity. And then there was another study that looked at healthy individuals not in an operative state, but looked at their pain sensitivity, so they did a battery test. And obviously pain is very complex and hard to measure because there's subjectivity to it. But when you compare person A to person A after good sleep and their bad sleep, as opposed to taking one person and like comparing me and Dain and our pain sensitivity would be silly. But taking Dain after he slept well and then taking it again after a slew of poor sleep, pain sensitivity goes up, because that has nothing to do with tissue damage, but then that will perpetuate things like people just grasping for that extra coffee to just get through, grasping for the Advil to get through, and so it's more about, none of this is about like one-off behaviors. Like, I've had nights where I slept a few hours maybe. It's not about that, and certain books out there will make it black and white enough because they're trying to sell an idea and the importance of it, and I do get that. But they'll make you also think that you're doomed if you had like a period of insomnia in your life, and that's not true. It is just important that we don't just accept that getting very little sleep and doing so chronically is necessary or helpful. And I don't know if every society is like this, but ours certainly has that sort of side of things. And it is shifting in certain areas, I think, but there is that sort of badge of honor of like, oh no, I'm just tired because I'm working so hard. It's like, okay, but you can work really hard and still prioritize sleep. In fact, you may have to work less hard if you prioritize sleep. And I understand there are a lot of other factors. It depends on your immediate environment, your home environment. Are you helping kids at night? Things like that. It's about the big picture, and can you do your best to optimize it? Or are you like resisting sleep by staying up, reading the news until 2 a.m. on a screen in your bed? I think that's an action item if you feel crummy. It's something that you can control.
Mm-hmm. Sleep also, it has a domino effect into everything. If you're struggling with your nutrition, for example, if you're getting cravings, you can't quite kick it, you can't keep to a nutrition habit you're trying to change, ask yourself, are you getting enough sleep? Because getting more sleep will facilitate better nutrition habits the next day. Are you having trouble sticking with movement and exercise regimen? Like, okay, are you sleeping enough? So you have the energy to, you're going to be more prone to move. And even people who are high achievers will tell you when they're better rested, guess what? They're more productive at their work. Sleep is one of those things that we just think of it kind of in the back. It's like, I'll get to it. So when I get all my stuff done, I'll sleep. But if you move sleep to the front of that line, all those other things that you have to accomplish, even including health, come more easily. So sleep is one that we, in our society just says, sleep when you're dead, that kind of thing. Bad advice.
It's slowly shifting, and there's been more attention to it.
It plays off of everything. So.
Yeah. Again, like everything else, I think we're still very much in the learning process towards what makes the human body tick. We don't have it all figured out, and sleep has thankfully received more attention, I would say, in the last 5 years than in the last 20 prior to that. Much like, the heart. We didn't know that smoking was bad. And then in the 60s, it was like, oh, that's the problem. Oh, shoot. So when people pick it apart, they're like, they used to advertise cigarettes. Yeah, it's because we literally didn't have the data. I mean, I know you can logically look at it and be like, oh yeah, of course, you're inhaling a thing. But the point is, we didn't know. Humans are like, this is a good thing. This feels good. I'm going to keep doing it. Oh, shoot, that's a risk factor. Darn.
Nowadays, we have a hard time pivoting to new information. But
yeah, we like to hold the old information over everybody's head. But you said, it's like, okay, but we were operating on the limited knowledge.
Yeah. Be curious. Learn, adapt. And it's tough. Change is hard, but that's how we get to where we want to go.
The thing is, I think everybody listening to this podcast probably moves every day and does their best to be well, but which is totally fine. It's just I do think it's really helpful to have an understanding of the broadness that is health, and it looks different for everyone, which is why I can't be pinpoint into beautiful little like one sentence of like mental and physical well-being. It's way more complex than that. It's slightly different for everybody, and it fluctuates over time.
Yeah, and again, so that's why if you are struggling with any certain aspect of health, you can check in on what have you normalized, and is that baseline or that subjective thought or feeling, is that actually serving you, and is that where you should be basing it on? You can challenge that, be curious about that, and it can help you make some change.
Yeah.
So the two books we did recommend earlier were Climate Change and Pandora's Lunchbox.
Both really good reads.
Excellent reads. And I think that's all for today.
That's all for today.
Amazing. Well, as always, thank you for joining us. Again, you can find us on Instagram, move_daily_EDS, or at movewelldaily.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on the Move Daily Health Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation. To hear more, head on over to Stitcher or iTunes and subscribe to the Move Daily Health Podcast. And don't hesitate to leave us a review. Thanks for listening.
I'm not going to stop this until you stop that.
Thank you.
I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
Nice, Fréyja.
I think we did it.
See, look, all we had to do was talk about why things have been all